So this video and the price increases of the 3DS is all actually coming at the perfect time because I just uploaded my Super Mario 3D Land Deep Dive Retrospective. It's just about 2 hours long and you can find it over on my alt channel Nintendine Plus along with a plethora of other 3D Mario retrospectives. 15 years later and the people finally want a 3DS. That might sound a bit harsh, but if you're looking at numbers in the US alone, the 3DS sold less than half of what the Switch family managed. And I mean, when you account for the fact that the 3DS had like 6 different models where the Switch only really had 3, that means even if you subtract the amount of enthusiasts on both consoles that bought multiple hardware variations of the Switch or the 3DS, the actual difference between the amount of people that bought the 3DS versus the Switch in the United States could be significantly larger than what we see on the financial reports, especially in the United States. The 3DS is interesting because through the majority of its life, the sales in Japan were outpacing the sales in the US. This was seen in almost every single financial report. In fairness, early on in the console's life, the US sales were more than Japan's, but that's obviously because there were more units allocated to the States. But as quickly as the end of the first year of the 3DS's life, the sales in Japan were outpacing the sales in the States. And this remained to be the case in pretty much every single quarter, all the way until 2018, where there was a big bump for the 3DS in the United States that continued through the end of 2019 actually, and those sales were mostly driven by the $79.99 model of the 2DS that was being sold as the budget option to the $300 Nintendo Switch. So with that final bump that the 3DS got just at the very end of its life, it allowed the US sales figures to be higher than Japan's by just under 1.5 million. This is as of March 31st, 2020. So while the 3DS did not perform as well as the Switch, in Japan it was only about 28% lower, as opposed to the States where it was like 55% lower. And something tells me we're going to be seeing something similar with the life of the Switch 2. Just like the 3DS, the Nintendo Switch 2 is proving to be a lot more popular in Japan than it is in the States. Just like the 3DS, they allocated significantly more units in the States, but the low sell-through rate in the States in comparison to the almost 100% sell-through rate in Japan has caused the numbers in Japan to outpace the ones in the States almost within the first 6 months. And depending on how many more units Nintendo actually allocates to Japan, the gap of Japanese Switch 2 owners in comparison to the US Switch 2 owners is going to increase significantly more in favor of the Japanese numbers. So we could very well be looking at a situation like the 3DS where nearly 1/3 of all of the sales are from Japan, which historically has meant that there's a pretty low cap on the amount of Switch 2 units that could actually be sold worldwide. Because the reality is those numbers that would make those portions as low as they are sales that are lost everywhere else, more specifically in the States. Now that being said, for those unaware, the price of the 3DS has really been jumping up in recent months. It's at the point where if you're looking for a 3DS XL or a regular 3DS, the cheaper lower end models could cost you over $100 alone, maybe $150 upwards. And then some of the higher end stuff, like let's say a new 3DS XL, which is the highest that you can get in excellent condition, could easily cost upwards of $350, with some of the special edition models being $400 to $500 even. So if you got a 3DS and you just haven't used it in a few years and you don't know what to do with it, this is probably a good time to cash in if you're not one for sentiment. Of course, this has led to many people rightfully pointing out that people are willing to spend as much on a 3DS as they would have a Switch 2, indicating that it's a sign of just how awful that the Switch 2 is that people are willing to buy a console that originally was nearly half the cost. And as much as I would love to get on that hate train, it's not exactly what's going on here. There are a lot of very good reasons as to why the Nintendo 3DS is an excellent purchase today, putting it very high in demand. And as we've learned with the past 6 months, when something is high in demand, it obviously goes up in price, as opposed to something like the Switch 2, which has seen discounts in the holiday season. But the reality is that outside of a very select few people, I highly doubt the enthusiasts that are buying a 3DS right now are specifically grabbing one because they don't like the Switch 2. Like, there might be a few people, but I'd argue that for the most part, the 3DS serves a very different crowd than what the Switch 2 does. And honestly, this is not the first time that the 3DS prices jump up. I remember around 2021, the prices had jumped up quite a bit. GameStop was unloading their stock. They were getting rid of 3DSs and 2DSs for around $100 to $150 depending on the model. And that caused a surge of retro collectors to go out there and buy them and scalp them. It was back then that I got a hold of my new 3DS XL. I also ended up getting a new 2DS XL just because GameStop was getting rid of them. And I already had an original 3DS, so my personal 3DS head count is already at 3. But I think that last surge of the 3DS sales was largely because of the retro game collection prices going up, a combination of the timing of that also being the pandemic, which increased prices on certain things that people were interested in. And also that was about a decade removed from the launch of the 3DS, so it's right around that time where the nostalgia cycle kicks in. Maybe it was hitting a little bit early because of the pandemic. It's also because the 3DS modding scene was phenomenal. That was like 5 or 6 years into it, so at that point, everything was pretty much optimal for those that are willing to hack their devices. And I'm guessing people realized that the 3DS eShop was going to be closing soon, so they needed to get in there while they still could. Obviously, quickly after that, things just kind of settled down a bit. The prices went back to normal. In general, a lot of those retro game prices started to balance out for a bit. And now that we're hitting roughly 15 years since the launch of the 3DS, everything that made it kind of jump up in price earlier during the time of the pandemic seems to be happening again, except this time it's happening a bit more naturally rather than being sparked because of people sitting at home and having nothing to do. But it's not only the nostalgia cycle that's making the 3DS prices go up. Like, we've seen that happen all the time. All of these retro consoles, especially the ones that don't necessarily sell as well. Like, the reality is you'll be able to grab a used Wii, a used DS, and a used Switch for a very long time for a fairly affordable price. The rest of the Nintendo consoles that sold fewer units generally have a higher trajectory depending on when you buy it, but I mean, in general, it's not really set in stone too, because depending on how many different devices you can actually play these games on, whether or not the games were re-released on Nintendo Switch Online, backwards compatibility matters, how easy it is to emulate something, all of these different factors affect the prices. But in a vacuum, with all other things equal, obviously the consoles that sold the most are the ones that will have the best resale price. And by best, I mean lowest for the buyer. The 3DS, 15 years after the launch of its original model, and I think the final model, was the new 2DS XL, came out in mid-2017. With production of every model ending in 2020, which also is a big reason why the prices went up back then. But yeah, seeing as how the 3DS base model is 15 years old and the newest one is like just hitting 9 years old, it makes sense there's a lot of interest from people right now because these are the consoles that they might have grown up with, sold it, parted ways, and decided that they want to get back into it now. You know, if this is a console that somebody had when they were between the ages of 10 and 13, now they would be in their early to mid-20s, have a little bit more time on their hands, are able to buy things with their own money instead of relying on their parents. So this would be their chance to get back into things. It's the nostalgia cycle. We've seen this every generation. But like I said, it's not just the nostalgia. The 3DS is also very popular because it's the last of its kind. Right, like back in the day, what a handheld console was is very different than what people call a handheld console now. I have a hard time calling the Switch family of consoles, except maybe the Switch Lite, depending on how big your pockets are. I have a hard time referring to them as handhelds. I have a hard time referring to them as portable consoles. And this includes all of the handheld gaming PCs. Nowadays, people have kind of put their own definitions of what's considered handheld and what's considered portable, and it seems like what I used to view as a handheld console is now called a pocketable console. But you know, back in the day, handheld, portable, pocketable, all this stuff was just one thing. It was just the handheld console. Basically, all of the Nintendo handhelds up until the 3DS, as well as the PSP and PS Vita, these were what the industry knew as handheld consoles. The console itself was more affordable, the games were also more affordable, many of them having games that probably would have fit better on the home console last generation or the generation before that, but the benefit was that the price would match the experience. Nowadays, the gaming industry has convinced us that handheld consoles should cost more than that because you're paying for portability. And to an extent, I could understand that if most of the games that were being played were not of the caliber of something that released in 2015 on a home console. But this whole narrative of handheld consoles being expensive only started recently. It's kind of funny because I remember around the later years of the Wii U, leading up until maybe 2020, when Nintendo used to release a 2D game, like the new Super Mario Bros. Games, for example, I think even up until the launch of Metroid Dread, I'd see YouTube channels like Game Explain, Nintendo Life, Arlo. They used to argue that these 2D experiences releasing at full price was a bit of a sham. And it's because we were conditioned to believe that 2D games were cheaper experiences. They were the budget ones. They were meant to be on the 3DS. And it's because for 15 to 20 years, that was the truth. So when the hybrid consoles came in, we kind of expected that we'd still get those budget 2D games, and we did, but they were sold at the full price. And really the last time there was a true handheld, pocketable, portable, whatever you want to call it, it was the 3DS. And right now, there are no alternatives for the general masses. I mean, technically, you could just play games on your phones if you wanted to. And that's what the casuals are doing. And then there are also like huge lineups of different Android emulation devices that people can buy. And that's what the enthusiasts are buying. And those come with a little bit of a learning curve. But there's a group somewhere in the middle of that doesn't want the mindless stuff that comes with mobile gaming, but also doesn't necessarily want to get into the emulation scene or the third-party device scene. And for them, the Nintendo 3DS might just check more boxes. You buy a Nintendo 3DS, you have access to the entirety of the 3DS library, which is massive. It's fully backwards compatible with the DS, and it's really the most ideal way to play those games, because even if you were to emulate them elsewhere, unless you got some like new, modern, funky handheld device that flips open, which are still kind of just recently hitting the market at a very high price, and the performance isn't always perfect with the 3DS games, I think. But outside of that, original hardware is basically the best way to experience the 3DS. Emulating it will get the job done, and for most games it works just fine. Works better than just fine sometimes. But it's never going to be the same, and the gap between original hardware and emulation is a lot more prevalent on these devices because of the dual screen setup. And then of course, if you add onto that the hacking scene, it's very easy to pirate the entirety of the 3DS library and put it on your console. Not that I'd condone it, but that's a reality. And then even emulation on that device, you can put all of your classic games on there. I mean, in one way or another, you can play the Nintendo DS, Game Boy Advance games, Game Boy Color, Game Boy, Game Gear, Virtual Boy, and even the Wonder Swan and Neo Geo Pocket, as well as the Neo Geo Pocket Color. And then for home consoles, while some of these might be limited to the new 3DS XL, which is obviously the most expensive console, you can actually run some PlayStation 1 games on there. The Nintendo 64 doesn't quite work on there, but some of the most popular Nintendo 64 games did get a re-release on the 3DS, so that's kind of taken care of to an extent. And then of course you have the Super NES, TurboGrafx, the NES, Sega Genesis, CD, 32X, Master System. So this makes the console very appealing not only for the entirety of the 3DS and the DS library, but you get all of those retro consoles in addition to it. And it folds up, puts in your pocket, you can take it anywhere, and you're getting a fairly decent battery life on it too. Not necessarily as good as what we saw in the DS, especially if you're playing 3DS games, but on the lower end, I'm usually getting 4 or 5 hours. And I've been able to extend that by keeping the 3D slider down and putting the brightness low. And that's only if I'm playing 3DS games. Once you look into the DS library and the emulation of the older stuff, it lasts much longer than that too. It's actually kind of funny because I've taken a lot of trips in the last few years where I used to take my Switch with me after that came out. You know, these would be work trips, so I'm normally taking like a work laptop with me and maybe a backpack. But over time, I kind of got fed up with having to pack my Switch and making sure it's put away properly so that the joysticks don't get screwed up, debating whether I want to take the massive charger that comes with a console with me or if I want to charge it using my Android charger, which will take significantly longer. Then I go to check in the bags and I got to take the Switch out of the bag. After a certain point in time, I'm just like, I don't know why I'm taking the Switch with me. Let me just take a 3DS. It just made things so much easier. I can throw it in my pocket, take it out as needed. The charger's pretty small too, and I don't even usually use it while I'm on these trips because I might not even hit a full 5 to 7 hours of playtime while I'm on these trips. And it was just such a refreshing reminder of what a true portable handheld console actually was. Packing a Switch didn't feel that much difference to packing a home console with me. But really, I was just like one HDMI cable away from packing a home console effectively. And the reality is, from the main publishers at least, there's just nothing like that anymore. Like obviously you could spend a pretty penny on one of these emulation devices that are out. Some of them are actually pretty affordable. But if you're looking at something official released by Nintendo like we had all grown up with from the days of the Game Boy until just recently, your only option and arguably best option right now is the 3DS. With the only caveat being that if you want better battery life, you can sacrifice the entirety of the 3DS library as well as a lot of the more intense emulation and grab an original DS instead. And the DS library is massive in and of itself, so you might not even need all of those retro games on there anyway. But I would sacrifice that battery life for the 3DS library and for the better options for emulation, especially because the 3DS library in and of itself feels a lot more like a modern game console than the DS library and before it. You know, like playing Mario Kart 7 feels very similar to playing Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Then I would understand if somebody enjoyed that more than Mario Kart World, for example. The size of the controller might not be for everybody, but playing Smash Bros. 3DS, it feels pretty good. I used to enjoy it. And then Samus Returns was one of my favorite 2D Metroid games. Obviously, you also have 3D Land, which yesterday I released a 2-hour-long deep dive retrospective video on, so check out my Nintendine Plus channel if you're interested in that. And then you got New Super Mario Bros. 2, the remakes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, Star Fox 64, Animal Crossing. Like, the whole 3DS library, while it is watered down, still feels pretty good to play. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend it for online. I don't even know if you can play online anymore. I don't really try. But normally for me, when I want to use a 3DS, I'm offline. I'm not interested in connecting to the internet anyway. Often I'm in a location where either I'm going to have weak internet or no internet, regardless. But for LAN play, it actually works pretty well. We took a flight with family. I had 3 3DSs. We passed them around the plane and we were able to play Mario Kart games together. So it was fun. And actually with the DS emulator on there, we were able to play some of the DS multiplayer games together too. I think we played Mario Party DS. But even without the multiplayer, there are just like years of single player games that you can play between the 3DS library and all of the retro stuff. And I doubt that most people buying a 3DS are buying it for the multiplayer experience anyway, especially in 2025 and 2026. But look, the reality is that the value proposition of what the 3DS offers in comparison to the Switch 2 is going to vary from person to person. And quite frankly, there's going to be a very big overlap of people that have both a Switch 2 and a Nintendo 3DS. It's entirely possible that somebody just bought a Switch 2 6 months ago, and then right now they drop another $200 or $300 on a 3DS. But for the sake of this discussion right now, I think that there's a very clear reason as to why the 3DS might be more appealing for people than the Switch 2, even if they serve different needs to an extent. The 3DS is exciting. It's unique. It's built well. Like, even as an old console, you know that that hardware on there is going to outlast whatever the Switch 2 has to offer, because that thing was made during a time where Nintendo actually wanted people to think that their quality was up there, as opposed to them trying to cut corners in order to motivate you to go and repurchase another Nintendo Switch 2 later. Or at least some Joy-Cons, or feel like you want to upgrade because your screen is worn out, whatever. There's also the reality that if you're somebody that skipped out on the 3DS, or if you're somebody that hasn't played a 3DS in over a decade, there's just a giant library of unique games that you can't experience anywhere else. The library of unique, exclusive Switch 2 games is going to be very small throughout this entire generation. Either it's going to have third-party titles that are playable for a much better experience on anything else, or it's going to be made up of cross-gen games or remakes or re-releases and Switch 2 editions of Switch 1 titles, or it's going to have a very small select few of exclusive titles that are significantly more expensive games than they should be. So while at some point, Switch 2 exclusive Nintendo first-party games could have a very big pool that makes it worth it to many, that probably won't happen until 5 or 6 years down the line. So let's say, for example, you're somebody that owns a Nintendo Switch, and that's the only Nintendo console that you have at this time, and then you also happen to own either a PS5, an Xbox, maybe even a PS4, because those are where a lot of the ports are coming from too, or obviously a PC, then the reality is the Switch 2 has very little to offer. But the 3DS, on the other hand, that's a whole different story. There's an entire library there. And you get the added bonus of having something that's actually pocketable, actually portable, something that you can take with you wherever you go, something that won't scratch easily. If you skipped out on the whole dual screen experience in general, or you haven't played in a very long time, that's like something new and exciting now. The whole 3D gimmick, while it's not a huge selling point and it might not be the main reason why somebody buys it, it's still pretty cool, especially if you haven't experienced the glasses-free 3D before. And of course, the games are significantly cheaper. Like, even if you're somebody that's not going to hack it, you're not going to pirate things, which, I'll be frank, I'm assuming most people buying a 3DS are fully intending on pirating 3DS games. But even if you don't, it's very easy to get phenomenal first-party Nintendo games for the prices of 30 to 40 bucks, maybe even 50 bucks for some of the rarer stuff. I mean, a loose copy of Mario Kart 7 is like 14 bucks right now if you go based off of pricecharting.com. Ocarina of Time 3D is 20 bucks, Animal Crossing New Leaf 21. And those prices go down if you happen to find somebody reselling a Nintendo Selects version of them too. And I think to an extent this all plays into why people are willing to spend more on a 3DS in 2026. You're paying a lot for the console, but the games are going to be much cheaper. It's the same logic as buying anything that's not a Switch 2 right now. For any of the handheld gaming PCs, the upfront cost is going to be as much as a Switch 2, maybe a little bit more. Even an Xbox Series X or a PS5, or even building a PC yourself. Everybody knows you're going to be spending more money up front, but you're quickly going to be getting that money back with how much cheaper games are once they're discounted especially. So somebody going out and buying a new 3DS XL for 400 or 450 bucks for a limited edition version, they're like, yeah, I'm buying it for the same price that I would buy a Switch 2. But even if they're not planning on pirating anything, for the price of Donkey Kong Bonanza and Mario Kart World, that's $150 right there, plus tax, you're probably going to be able to grab between 5 and 8 of the best games on the 3DS. So it's well worth it for a lot of people to jump into the 3DS right now, even if it seems absurd that people are willing to spend that much on what we would all consider outdated and old hardware. But the value is there, and the reality is there's a void. Not only a void because we've moved on from the traditional handheld console, but also a void because we saw how well the 3DS sold after the original Switch came out, because they discounted the heck out of the 3DS at the end of that life cycle. So even though the Nintendo Switch was still considered the budget console, there was a budget Nintendo option, that being the last gen console. And right now, while the 3DS games that I just mentioned on pricecharting.com are between 20 and 30 bucks or whatever, back then you could find them for like $5 to $10 because it was the end of the 3DS's life, and that's usually when games get cheaper. Right now you could probably find a Nintendo Switch for a fairly affordable price, the original Switch. But the games are still pretty much considered modern day Nintendo titles because the Switch 2 is just the Switch 1 library again. So the used market didn't get that huge drop off that you would normally expect, and it's made even worse because Nintendo doesn't offer discounts on their first party titles outside of like a 5-minute window twice a year, and even then it's an insulting, laughable discount. So this causes their used games to be much more expensive than they should be. But if Nintendo had released a Switch 2, decided to turn around and drop the price of the Switch 1 to $100, offer a great discount like they did with the 3DS, finally discount their Switch 1 library. I mean, gosh, they could have pushed the Switch Lite at $150 and just bundled it in with Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, and that alone would have been people's Christmas gift of choice. But instead, they did the opposite. They increased the price of their Switch 1, a console that they don't plan on selling that many units of this year anyway, and they're porting over all of their Switch games, which a lot of them were just Wii U games, and charging more for them on the Switch 2, forcing the price of all of the Switch games to be just as high now as they were at launch. So now most money-conscious people, gamers on a budget, I'd say even smart people, those that normally would be like, oh, this is the perfect time to jump into the last-gen console or buy one for my kid, they have little reason to grab a Switch. And if they already have a Switch, they have little reason to upgrade to a Switch 2. So instead, the 3DS just makes a lot more sense. It's not surprising to me as to why the price of the 3DS on the secondhand market is as high as it is right now, because the reality is, with how poor its sales were here in the States, most people that were excited for something new and exciting going into the Nintendo Switch 2 are realizing that they could find some new and exciting Nintendo magic, but instead of moving forward, they're going backwards. So while the Switch 2 and all of its drawbacks may not be the whole picture as to why the 3DS prices have gone up, it's undeniably a huge part of it. People want exciting Nintendo magic, and if you're somebody that's had the Switch for 7 or 8 years, and you're looking for that magic, the 3DS is a no-brainer. And clearly there are a whole lot of people that feel this way because demand is increasing, causing the 3DS prices to go up, while the Switch 2 demand decreased, causing its price pretty much worldwide outside of Japan to go down. Which is hilarious because it's only been out for 7 months.